December 1964. Snow blanketed the grounds of St. Mary's Church on the outskirts of Boston, sealing it in silence. The sky was the same dull gray as the frozen earth. No horizon, no division between heaven and dust. Inside, the church had just reopened after 15 years of abandonment following the old fire. The walls were still stained with soot. The air smelled of candle wax and damp wood, stale like the breath of something long dead. Margaret Leary stepped inside, clutching a stack of worn sheet music. Her heels echoed across the nave, mingling with the faint metallic sway of the cross overhead. She had been invited by the parish council to restore the children's choir, part of a quiet effort to bring Christmas back to St. Mary's. For Margaret, it was a chance to begin again, and perhaps a way to forget the child who never came into the world. The recording room lay beyond the last pews, once the quarters of the old music teacher. Dust covered everything. In the corner stood a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its casing corroded, surrounded by reels marked in faded ink. One bore a handwritten label, Christmas Choir, 1949. Margaret slid it into the machine. The tape hissed to life, a rasping breath, as if someone were about to speak after years of silence. At first came the sound of children singing, clear, steady, the familiar melody of the Coventry Carol. But after a few seconds, the tone shifted. Another voice joined in, low, slow, and reversed, as though the song were folding in on itself. Each warped note seemed to pull at Margaret's heartbeat until it faltered. She stopped the machine, frozen, listening as the echo of that voice dissolved into the stillness. Outside, the church bell struck 12. In the silence that followed, the tape recorder's microphone light flickered on by itself, crackling with static, then played one last line. Lully, lully, thou little tiny child. The lullaby was gentle, but its sweetness lingered like a farewell. Margaret turned off the power and stood. At the end of the corridor stood an old nun, Sister Agnes, who had served St. Mary's for 4 decades. Her eyes were steady, filled with something Margaret couldn't name. Worry, perhaps, or memory. Margaret lowered her head in greeting, but when she looked up again, the hall was empty. On the table, the tape still turned slowly, though the plug hung loose from the wall. Strands of magnetic tape unwound from the reel, thin as human hair, coiling into a perfect circle like a cradle. Margaret stared for a moment, then forced a shaky laugh. Just a short circuit, she told herself. Before leaving the church, she turned back one last time. Inside the recording room, the red light of the microphone glowed once more. Through the cracked window came the sound of a distant choir, soft, cold, and ancient. No one could tell whether it came from the living or the dead. The next morning, snow fell heavier, covering the churchyard like a sheet of white cloth. The air was so still that every small footstep echoed sharply, hesitant, rhythmic, and fragile. Margaret stood at the lectern, arranging the worn pages of music on the stand. Light from the frosted windows spread a golden haze across the drifting snow dust, reflecting on the children's faces as they sat silently, eyes fixed on her, waiting. The first notes of the organ trembled through the cold air. Margaret signaled for them to begin. The children's voices rose together, clear, delicate, almost translucent. The Coventry Carol filled the hall, an ancient lullaby threaded with quiet sorrow. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift into the melody, until a strange resonance crept in. Low, dark, deep, not belonging to any child in the choir. Her eyes snapped open. The children were still singing, lips moving in perfect time. But in the hollow acoustics of the church, another voice lingered beneath theirs. A woman's voice, slower by half a beat, echoing as if from behind the empty pews. Margaret glanced around. Only the children's coats hung by the door, swaying gently in the draught that seeped through the cracks. A small girl in the front row lifted her head. Her eyes widened, fixed on the fogged window. Outside, only snow pressed thick against the glass, yet she whispered something that made the others fall silent. A gust swept through the hall, snuffing out the candle on the lectern. A thin ribbon of blue smoke curled upward toward the ceiling. Margaret's heart thudded fast, but she steadied her breath and gestured for them to start again. The music returned, stronger now, almost defiant. In the recording room, the reel-to-reel machine captured every note until the waveform needle began to twitch erratically. The sound bent and warped into unnatural shapes, shapes that for a fleeting second resembled a woman's face, tilted tenderly as if cradling a child. Margaret didn't see it, but Sister Agnes, watching through the narrow window in the hallway, did. She crossed herself slowly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The rehearsal ended in uneasy quiet. The snowfall had stopped, leaving the ground damp and raw. Margaret gathered the music sheets, her hands trembling slightly. The air in the room felt thick, disturbed, as though someone else had just been there. She removed the tape from the recorder, slipped it into her coat pocket, and led the children out. That night, the wind howled through the streets. At the far end of the road leading to the church, someone found a small wool hat lying half buried in the snow, the same hat that belonged to the boy who sang in the last row of the choir. He had not come home. Sheriff Harold Brown was called to the scene. Under the harsh beam of his car lights, he looked up at the bell tower of St. Mary's, where snow clung to the stone like scars on a frozen corpse. He had seen this before, exactly 15 years ago. In the darkness, faint and off-key, came the sound of children singing, as though the song refused to end. In the days following the disappearance, St. Mary's Church sank into a heavy silence, thick as frozen fog. Margaret sat alone in the music room, pale light filtering through frost-clouded glass and falling across the sheet music spread before her. Each time she replayed the rehearsal tape, she heard something different. A faint breath, a stretched note, sometimes a distant lullaby threading itself between the children's voices. She began researching the song's history. The Coventry Carol had been written in the 16th century to commemorate the massacre of the innocents, when King Herod ordered the slaughter of all newborns in Bethlehem. The hymn was meant as a mother's lullaby, sung to her child before the soldiers came. But in St. Mary's old archives, Margaret found a faded annotation. Do not sing after sundown. Do not change the key. Do not stop midway. Below that, scrawled in black ink, were 3 words, the mother's call. That night, Margaret dreamed of snow falling inside the church. Amid the glow of candles, she saw a woman cloaked in black standing among the children's choir, holding a small bundle wrapped in scorched cloth. The woman began to sing, a sound so familiar it seemed to rise from Margaret's own throat. When she awoke, her pillow was damp with tears, and in the stillness of dawn she could still hear the whisper of Lully, Lully, Lully. The next morning, Sister Agnes came to see her. Her face was bloodless, her eyes sunken deep. She confessed that in 1949, she had led the choir herself. On Christmas Eve that year, a fire had consumed the rear sanctuary of the church. 5 children vanished, but no remains were ever found. When the flames died, all that was left on the floor were their tiny shoes, lined neatly side by side, as if the children had taken them off before leaving. Since that night, every Christmas season, Sister Agnes had heard the song return, drifting from the basement even after the church was sealed. Margaret said nothing. She did not believe in ghosts, yet since taking the job, the boundaries of reason in her mind had begun to blur. Every night, when the wind moaned through the cracks, she heard the faint laughter of children in the empty corridors, and beneath it, the woman's voice, soft, mournful, echoing in rhythm with her own heartbeat. In the mirror, Margaret's reflection stared back, the red glow of a microphone light flickering in her eyes like 2 small embers waiting to ignite. She played the latest recording. The waveform trembled slightly, then a woman's voice emerged, lower now, clearer, and deliberate. "Mother's here." The lullaby merged with the cries of unseen children. Margaret sat frozen, every hair on her neck standing upright. A draft swept through the doorway, carrying a chill that pierced her skin like glass. And in that instant, she understood. The mother in the song was searching for her child. And the hymn she had thought was holy was only a call home. On the night of December 24th, snow fell thick and relentless, burying the streets around St. Mary's in a pale shroud. The city had gone silent, save for the wind whistling through old glass panes, moaning like a lost voice. Margaret entered the church, her coat soaked through, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Everything shimmered in the dim silver of ash and frost. On the choir platform, 12 children stood waiting. Their cheeks were flushed from the cold, eyes bright beneath the candlelight. Margaret looked at them and felt a strange pull of recognition, as if the choir from 1949 had returned, one by one. She adjusted the microphone. The red light blinked. Everything was ready for the final rehearsal. Sheriff Harold Brown watched from the back of the church, sent to ensure safety after rumors of strange sounds had spread through the town. Sister Agnes sat in the front pew, her trembling hands clutching a rosary. When the clock struck 8, Margaret raised her hand to begin. The children's voices rose, soft and pure as morning mist. "Lolly, lully, thou little tiny child." The melody filled the hall, vibrating through the stone until the air itself seemed to hum with an unseen depth. Then, something else joined in, a sound low and rough, rising from beneath the floorboards. The pitch faltered. Margaret froze. A sharp pain tightened in her chest, the hairs on her arms lifting like static. The microphone crackled, and the low female voice returned, clearer this time. "Sleep now, my darling." The church lights flickered. Candles shuddered, their flames bending under the sudden rush of wind tearing down the aisle. Harold lunged toward the fuse box, but nothing responded. The power was dead. The main doors slammed shut behind him, the lock twisting on its own. The air grew thick with the smell of melted wax and old smoke. On the walls, the paintings of saints began to blur and fade, replaced by the figure of a woman in a black cloak holding a child. Her face was hollow, the sockets empty and deep. The children's singing weakened. They looked around, terrified. Margaret tried to speak, to stop them, but her throat locked tight. No sound came out. The floor began to crack. From the widening gaps rose a cold breath, carrying the lullaby's tune. "The mother calls," Sister Agnes whispered, her lips drained of color. A sudden gust tore through the room, lifting the sheet music from the stand. The pages spun in the air and burst into flame before vanishing into the dark. One by one, the children faded. No screams, no footsteps, just dissolving into the mist that swirled around the altar, leaving behind coats and crumpled pages. Margaret lunged forward, reaching out, but her hand had only a chill that bit through to the bone. And then, the woman in the cloak stepped closer. She leaned in, her breath cold against Margaret's ear, her voice trembling like wind through a graveyard. "Thank you for singing her song." The room went black. When Harold finally forced the doors open, the church was empty. Only Sister Agnes remained, motionless in the front pew, her rosary snapped in half beneath her hands. At the center of the altar lay Margaret, on her back, eyes wide open, lips moving faintly around her final words. "Lully, lully." And somewhere beneath the floor, from the dark belly of the church, came the sound of children singing. Slow, steady, and eternal. 3 days after Christmas, the sky over Boston sank into a colorless ash gray. The snow had stopped, but the fog was so thick that even the spire of St. Mary's could no longer be seen from across the street. Police barricades encircled the church, an ongoing investigation, yet most locals kept their distance, as if merely standing nearby might let them hear something they should never hear. Harold Brown was the only one left inside. On the long wooden table in the recording room, the old reel-to-reel machine still sat where he had left it, its indicator light flickering weakly. He slipped on his headphones and pressed play. The tape crackled to life, hissing, then unfurling the song he had listened to hundreds of times throughout his search, the Coventry Carol. At first, only the children's voices filled the air. But, as always, another voice emerged, a woman's, lower, slower, drawn out as though each word were pulled from the dark itself. Harold closed his eyes. He could hear the breathing, the faint shuffle of feet moving around the microphone. Then, midway through the second verse, came a sound that hadn't been there before, a grown person weeping. He rewound the tape. The sobbing returned, closer this time, almost against the mic. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't have sung my song." Harold shot to his feet. The room was empty, lit only by the sickly hum of a dying neon bulb. He opened the reel and held the tape up to the light. Along the magnetic strip, a burn mark curved like a fingerprint, as if someone had touched it with something hot and metal. The investigation report would later note, no signs of violence, no body, no blood. Only a scatter of grey ash mixed with snow, and 12 pairs of small shoes, neatly arranged around the choir platform. Sister Agnes died 2 days later, her heart giving out in her sleep. Before she passed, she left a note tucked inside her Bible, scrawled in trembling letters. "The mother has been sung, but she still searches." Harold closed the case file and prepared to leave. But as he stepped through the church doors, faint music drifted up from below, the basement, far beneath the floorboards. He stopped, turned, and listened. The melody was fragile, almost tender, whispering through the cold air. Lully, lully, lully. That night, the red light above St. Mary's recording booth flicked on again. No one knew why Harold had returned. By morning, the snow had sealed the church shut from the outside. When rescuers forced the doors open, the studio was empty. The reel-to-reel still spun, the tape looping endlessly. The final recording lasted exactly 3 minutes and 16 seconds. No voices, no instruments. Only a lullaby, distant and thin, cut off abruptly mid-phrase. Then silence. But in that last second, if one listened closely enough, a faint breath could be heard. Long, heavy, and cold, as though a mother were leaning close to hush her child to sleep. St. Mary's Church was permanently closed in January 1950. No one in Boston has sung the Coventry Carol since. Yet, on some Christmas midnights, locals claim that when the bells strike 12, a woman's voice can still be heard inside the abandoned church, blending with the echo of children's choirs, rehearsing forever for a performance that never came. And in the stillness after the song, the microphone lights up again.